November 1640. Rain hammered against the leaded windows of Forty Hall as its owner, one of London's wealthiest men, sat alone in the great chamber he had built with such pride just 8 years earlier. Sir Nicholas Rainton, Lord Mayor of London, haberdasher to kings, master of a trading empire that stretched across 3 continents, had been stripped of everything. Not by bankruptcy, not by scandal, but by a single fatal word. No. He had refused King Charles I's demand for a forced loan, and now he sat imprisoned in his own magnificent house, watching guards patrol the grounds he had so lovingly designed. The irony was exquisite and terrible. He had built this palace to celebrate his triumph. Instead, it became his jail. And somewhere beneath these very foundations lay the ruins of another palace, one that had belonged to kings themselves, now utterly forgotten, its stones scattered, its memory erased. 2 palaces, 1 site, one destroyed to make way for the other. One built to proclaim immortality, the other proving its impossibility. This is the story of Forty Hall, a house that devoured a royal palace, imprisoned its creator, survived fire and revolution, and stands today as the last witness to secrets buried beneath English soil for 400 years. To understand how a simple haberdasher dared to build where kings once walked, we must go back to the beginning, to a young man with nothing but ambition and the dangerous gift of knowing exactly what the powerful desired. Nicholas Rainton was born in 1569 in the village of Oundle, Northamptonshire, into a world where birth determined destiny and a yeoman farmer's son had no business dreaming of palaces. His father worked land that would never be his own. His mother could neither read nor write. The boy had 3 options: follow his father into subsistence farming, apprentice to a local tradesman, or risk everything on London. At 14, Nicholas chose London. The year was 1583, and the city was a seething cauldron of 50,000 souls, where fortunes were made and lost before breakfast, where plague took 10,000 lives in a summer, and where a clever boy with steady hands and sharper eyes could transform thread and fabric into power itself. He became apprenticed to a haberdasher, one of the merchant guilds that controlled not just trade, but the very fabric of English society. The worshipful company of haberdashers didn't just sell hats and ribbons. They were financiers, political kingmakers, the invisible hands that moved the wealth of nations. A haberdasher furnished the wardrobe of nobility. A haberdasher held the debts of lords. A haberdasher knew which families were rising and which were one bad harvest from ruin. Young Nicholas learned to read more than ledgers. He learned to read men. His apprenticeship lasted 7 brutal years. 7 years of 16-hour days measuring silk, tallying accounts, memorizing the exact shade of crimson preferred by the Earl of Essex, the precise width of lace favoured by ladies of the court. 7 years of sleeping on the shop floor, eating the cheapest bread, saving every farthing. In 1590, at age 21, Nicholas Rainton became a freeman of the Haberdashers' Company. He had precisely £43 to his name. £43 to build an empire. He married strategically, wedding the daughter of a prosperous draper, a union that brought him connections more valuable than gold. Her family's network stretched from the wool markets of East Anglia to the dye works of Antwerp. Through her relatives, Nicholas gained access to continental suppliers who could provide fabrics unavailable to his competitors. Italian velvets, French silks, Flemish lace. While other haberdashers sold English broadcloth to English customers, Nicholas Rainton began importing luxuries that made courtiers gasp and pay whatever he asked. But importing wasn't enough. By 1595, Rainton had identified the real source of wealth: the Virginia Company and the East India Company, the great trading monopolies that were beginning to reshape the world economy. He invested early and heavily, buying shares when others thought these ventures mad gambles. The Americas? Savage wilderness? India? Impossibly distant. Rainton saw what they didn't: These companies didn't just trade goods, they created markets, controlled supply, set prices. They were printing money. The first Virginia Company shipment returned in 1608 with tobacco. Rainton's shares quintupled in value overnight. He reinvested everything. By 1610, he was no longer simply a haberdasher. He was a merchant venturer, a man with cargo on ships sailing to Jamestown, to Surat, to the Spice Islands. His warehouse on Thames Street held goods worth more than most manor houses, chests of nutmeg worth their weight in silver, bolts of silk that could buy farms, pearls that adorned the necks of duchesses. The numbers were staggering. In 1590, Nicholas Rainton had £43. By 1620, his personal wealth exceeded £50,000, equivalent to approximately £40 million today. He owned property across London, held shares in 4 trading companies, served as a governor of the Haberdashers' Company, and maintained a personal staff of 37 servants. He had achieved something almost impossible. He had transformed himself from peasant stock to the very edge of the aristocracy. Almost. Because there remained one position he had not yet claimed, one title that would mark his absolute triumph. Lord Mayor of London. The Lord Mayor wasn't merely a civic official. He was, for his year in office, the most powerful non-royal figure in England, the master of the nation's wealth, the man who could make or break kings. Charles I himself would need the Lord Mayor's cooperation to fund his wars, his courts, his very reign. Nicholas Rainton wanted that power, and in 1632 he seized it. But before he could become Lord Mayor, before he could walk in robes of scarlet and ermine through streets lined with cheering crowds, Nicholas Rainton needed something else. He needed a house worthy of a Lord Mayor, not in crowded, filthy London, but in the countryside, where land meant legitimacy and architecture announced ancestry. He needed a palace. And he knew exactly where to build it. 40 Hill. The name itself was a mystery, debated by antiquarians for centuries. Some claimed it derived from Fort Hill, suggesting Roman fortifications. Others insisted it came from a local family, the Fortees, though records were maddeningly vague. The most intriguing theory, whispered but never proven, was that it referred to the 40 acres of the old royal estate that had once crowned this gravel plateau. Because this land was haunted by royal ghosts. Beneath the soil where Nicholas Rainton planned to build his monument lay the ruins of Elsyng Palace, one of the most magnificent royal residences of Tudor England, a palace that had hosted Henry VIII, witnessed the childhood of Edward VI, and then vanished so completely that within 2 generations men argued about whether it had ever existed at all. Elsyng Palace was built in the 1490s by Sir Thomas Lovell, one of the most powerful men in Henry VII's court. It was a palace in the modern style, built not for defence but for display, with courtyards and galleries, gardens and fountains, a great hall where 500 could feast. When Lovell died in 1524, Henry VIII acquired the property and transformed it into a residence for his children. The young Prince Edward, later Edward VI, spent his early childhood here, tutored in Latin and Greek in chambers overlooking deer parks that stretched for miles. But palaces are expensive, and the Tudor dynasty was always desperate for cash. When Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558, she found herself ruling an England nearly bankrupted by religious wars and her father's architectural megalomania. She owned too many palaces, and maintaining them drained the treasury. Elsyng Palace, remote from London and rarely visited, became expendable. In 1562, Elizabeth gave the estate to a confidant and politician Sir William Cecil, later Lord Burghley, one of the great statesmen of the age. He used it occasionally, but preferred his other properties. The palace began its slow decline. By 1600, Elsyng was falling into ruin. Roofs leaked, stone walls crumbled. The great hall's timbers rotted. What had once echoed with royal laughter now sheltered owls and rats. In 1617, the property was sold to Sir George Croke, a judge who had no interest in restoring a palace. He wanted the land, not the building. Elsyng was stripped for materials. Lead was torn from roofs and sold. Oak beams were repurposed for humbler structures. Stone was carted away to build farmhouses and walls. By 1625, almost nothing remained above ground. A royal palace that had taken decades to build and centuries to perfect was erased in less than a generation. Only the foundations remained, buried and forgotten. This was the ground Nicholas Rainton chose. This was where he would build his immortality, on top of vanished kings. Did he know? Historical records don't say whether Rainton was aware he was building on royal ruins. Perhaps he saw it as poetic justice, the merchant prince supplanting the blood princes, the new wealth of trade replacing the old wealth of conquest. Or perhaps he simply saw excellent land, a gravel plateau with good drainage, elevated above the floodplains, commanding views across the Lea Valley. Either way, by 1629, Nicholas Rainton owned 40 Hill. But here the historical record becomes murky, confused, contradictory. Because, according to some documents, Nicholas Rainton didn't build 40 Hall at all. In 1858, the antiquarian historian John Tough published a detailed survey of Enfield's historic properties. When he came to 40 Hall, he made a startling claim. The house, Tough wrote, was not built by Sir Nicholas Rainton, but by a man named Sir Hugh Fortey, and Rainton merely purchased it. Tough cited a 1635 survey describing the property as a copyhold house, sometime Hugh Fortey's and late Sir Thomas Gurney's. If Tough was correct, then the entire accepted history of 40 Hall was wrong. Who was Sir Hugh Fortey? Records are frustratingly sparse. A Hugh Fortey appears in land records from the 1620s, described as a gentleman of Enfield. He held property on 40 Hill. He built, or perhaps began building, a substantial house, and then he disappears from history. No death record, no will, no descendants claiming the property. It's as if he was erased as thoroughly as Elsyng Palace itself. Sir Thomas Gurney is equally mysterious. Land records show he briefly held the property in the early 1630s, but there's no indication he ever lived there or contributed to its construction. He seems to have been a speculator, buying and quickly reselling. By 1632, the property was definitely in Nicholas Rainton's possession. Whether he built it from foundation stones or purchased a nearly complete structure, he made it his own, and it became forever associated with his name. Modern architectural historians, examining the building in exhaustive detail for Enfield Council's conservation plan, have concluded the truth is likely somewhere between the traditional story and Tough's revision. The evidence suggests that Hugh Fortey may have begun construction around 1627 to 1628, possibly building the central block, but ran out of money or died before completion. Rainton acquired the unfinished house around 1629 to 1630 and finished the construction, adding his own modifications and completing the interiors to his specifications. This would explain both the 1635 survey's reference to Fortey and the strong association with Rainton. It would also explain certain architectural irregularities. The house shows evidence of changing plans mid-construction, suggesting multiple patrons with different visions. Regardless of who laid the first stones, by 1632, 40 Hall was complete and belonged to Nicholas Rainton, Lord Mayor of London. And it was magnificent. 40 Hall rises from its gravel plateau like a challenge to gravity and good sense, a massive square block of red brick with stone dressings, asserting permanence in an age when most English houses were still built of timber and wattle. The house measures 120 feet along each side of its main block, 3 stories high, topped with a roof that seems almost Dutch in its steep pitch, punctured by chimneys rising like castle towers. This was not the architecture of kings. kings built in stone, vast, sprawling complexes like Hampton Court or Whitehall. This was the architecture of the newly powerful, the merchant princes who understood that brick meant modernity, that classical proportions meant civilization, that a house must announce its owner's status from a mile away. The style is Jacobean transitional, poised between the medieval and the classical, between the England of Elizabeth and the England of Charles, between an age of walled castles and an age of elegant villas. You can see the tension in every element. The facade facing south is the house's public face, the aspect designed to impress visitors approaching from London. It's composed with mathematical precision, perfect symmetry, windows aligned in strict vertical rows, a central entrance marked by a modest porch. Count the windows. 5 across on the ground floor, the central one forming the entrance. 5 on the first floor, each topped with triangular pediments. 5 on the second floor, simpler, more utilitarian. This is Palladian proportion applied to English materials, the emerging language of the Renaissance imposed on stubborn native tradition. But look closer and you see something stranger. The bricks aren't uniform. They vary in color from deep crimson to pale orange, creating an almost leopard spot effect. This wasn't intentional artistry, it was the reality of 17th century brickmaking, where every kiln produced slightly different results. What seems like chaos from close-up reads as texture from a distance, the wall vibrating with subtle variation, alive in changing light. The entrance porch is surprisingly modest for a house of this scale. Just 4 columns supporting a triangular pediment, the kind of feature you might find on a minor Italian church. This restraint was calculated. Rainton wasn't announcing himself as a man of vulgar display, but as a man of refined classical taste. The columns are Doric, the simplest of the classical orders, representing strength and masculine virtue. No elaborate Corinthian capitals dripping with acanthus leaves, no Ionic scroll work, just clean, powerful verticals. This was a merchant's classicism, expensive but not showy, learned but not ostentatious. Step through that modest entrance and the restraint evaporates. The entrance hall runs the full depth of the house, from south to north, a corridor of power 50 feet long. The ceiling rises 20 feet overhead, ribbed with plaster moldings in geometric patterns, rectangles within rectangles, creating the illusion of even greater height. The floor is stone, great slabs of limestone from quarries in the Midlands, each stone 3 feet square, laid in a checkerboard pattern. This floor would have cost more than an average house. Walk the length of the hall and your footsteps echo, announcing your presence to everyone in the building. That was the point. This was a space designed for processions, for the formal movement of important bodies, for the theatre of power. Originally, a grand staircase rose from the center of this hall, an architectural set-piece designed to channel visitors upward to the state rooms on the first floor. But here we encounter one of 40 Hall's great mysteries and tragedies. Sometime in the 18th century, that staircase was moved. We don't know exactly when or why, but architectural evidence suggests it happened during the major refurbishment of the 1690s, possibly following a fire. The staircase was relocated to the northwest corner of the house, tucked away, no longer the dramatic focal point. For centuries, visitors climbed a staircase hidden in shadows rather than ascending in glory. Only in 2012, after painstaking research by conservation architects examining paint layers, plaster details, and floor joists, was the staircase restored to something approximating its original position and grandeur. But let's return to 1632, to the house as Nicholas Rainton first inhabited it, before fires and renovations and the slow accumulation of changes. Turn right from the entrance hall and you enter the great parlour, the principal reception room on the ground floor. This room occupies the entire southeast corner of the house, 30 feet by 25 feet, with windows on two sides flooding the space with southern and eastern light. The ceiling here is the house's greatest glory, an explosion of ornamental plasterwork that must have taken master craftsmen months to create. The design is complex, almost overwhelming. Geometric compartments filled with fruit, flowers, faces, abstract patterns. At the center, a massive pendant hangs down 3 feet, covered in layers of molded plaster forming a kind of frozen fountain, a cascade of decorative elements that draw the eye upward and hold it captive. This ceiling cost approximately £150, equivalent to 3 years' wages for a skilled craftsman. It represents thousands of hours of work by plasterers who learned their trade in the great houses of Italy and France. Why such extravagance on a ceiling? Because in the 17th century, ceilings were the primary surface for artistic display. Floors were covered with rushes or simple carpets. Walls were hung with tapestries or wood paneling. But ceilings were permanent, unchangeable, the ultimate demonstration of a patron's taste and wealth. A magnificent ceiling said, "I have not just money, but discernment. I am not just rich, but cultured. I belong among the educated elite." The great parlour's walls were originally covered with oak panelling, creating a warm, dark background for the white plaster ceiling. Against the south wall stood a massive fireplace, 8 feet wide, with a stone surround carved with classical motifs. Acanthus scrolls, egg and dart moulding, the kind of details you'd find in Roman temples. The fireplace burned oak logs 4 feet long, producing enough heat to warm the entire room even in the depths of January. Furniture in this room would have included long tables made from single planks of oak, chairs with carved backs and leather upholstery, perhaps a virginal or small harpsichord for musical entertainment. This was where Rainton received important guests, conducted business, signed contracts worth thousands of pounds. The room had to project both comfort and authority. Across the hall to the west was the dining parlour, slightly smaller but equally elaborate, where the family took their daily meals and where Rainton entertained smaller groups. This room featured another ornamental ceiling, though less complex than the great parlours, and a fireplace with a carved overmantel depicting scenes from Ovid's Metamorphoses, Daphne transforming into a laurel tree, Actaeon torn apart by his own hounds, Zeus descending as a golden shower. Classical education made tangible. These were not random decorative choices. In the 17th century, educated men were expected to recognize these stories, to understand the moral lessons embedded in myth. A guest who couldn't identify Actaeon marked himself as uncultured. A guest who understood the symbolism proved himself worthy company. The ground floor also contained service rooms, a buttery for storing wine and ale, a pantry for bread and dry goods, offices for the steward who managed the household accounts. These rooms were simpler, with plain ceilings and stone floors, functional rather than decorative. The household hierarchy was literally built into the architecture. Servants worked in simple spaces. Guests experienced splendor. Climb the restored staircase to the first floor, the piano nobile, the noble level, where the house's most important rooms occupied the prime real estate. The great chamber dominates the southeast corner, directly above the great parlour, mirroring its dimensions but even more elaborate in decoration. This was the most formal room in the house, used for receiving the most distinguished guests, for important negotiations, for displaying the owner's power. The ceiling here reaches 12 feet high, divided into elaborate geometric compartments filled with plasterwork depicting fruit, flowers, mythological creatures, abstract patterns. Each compartment is different, creating a sense of endless variety and abundance. The walls were covered with tapestries, woven scenes from ancient history or biblical narratives, each tapestry worth hundreds of pounds. These weren't just decoration, they were insulation, helping keep the room warm in winter, and they were investments, portable wealth that could be sold in an emergency. Against the east wall stood a state bed, even though this wasn't a bedroom in the modern sense. State beds were furniture for display, enormous constructions 10 feet tall with wooden frames carved like architecture, hung with silk or velvet curtains, topped with plumes of ostrich feathers. The bed announced, "I am so wealthy I have a bed I never sleep in, purely for show." The first floor also contained family bedchambers, smaller rooms where Rainton and his wife actually slept, and closets, tiny private spaces where one could read, write letters, or pray without interruption. Privacy was a luxury in the 17th century, even for the wealthy. Most people slept in shared rooms, conducted business in public spaces, lived their lives in front of servants and family. A closet, a room with a door that locked, where one could be alone, was almost decadent. The second floor was simpler, divided into smaller chambers for children, guests, and upper servants. The ceilings here were plain plaster, the floors bare wood. This was comfortable but not luxurious space, appropriate for family but not for display. At the top of the house, in the attics beneath the steep roof, slept the lower servants, chambermaids, kitchen boys, stable hands. They climbed narrow back stairs, invisible to guests, moving through the house like ghosts, maintaining the illusion that everything happened by magic, that food appeared without cooking, that rooms cleaned themselves, that fires burned without anyone carrying coal. The house's exterior was surrounded by formal gardens, though nothing of the original 1630s layout survives. We can infer from comparable properties what they must have looked like. Geometric beds filled with herbs and flowers, gravel paths forming perfect squares and rectangles, perhaps a knot garden with low hedges creating intricate patterns, a fountain if Rainton was especially ambitious. Gardens in this period were about imposing order on nature, demonstrating human control over the wild world. A formal garden said, "I am civilized, rational, master of my environment." Beyond the formal garden stretched parkland, about 40 acres originally, though this would later expand dramatically. The park contained deer, the ultimate status symbol. Only aristocrats and the very wealthy were allowed to maintain deer parks. Deer meant you had enough land that you could waste acres on animals that served no practical purpose beyond being hunted for sport and served at banquets. Deer meant you were mimicking royalty. Rainton stocked his park with fallow deer, graceful creatures with spotted coats, and employed a parker to manage them, another mouth to feed, another salary to pay, another demonstration of wealth so excessive you could afford to throw it away. To the northwest of the house, Rainton built a separate stable complex around 1636, shortly after the main house was completed. This stable block, which remarkably survives today almost unchanged, is a jewel of functional architecture. The entrance gateway is crowned with a triangular pediment, classical architecture applied to a building for horses, elevating even the servants' servants. The stableyard could accommodate 20 horses, the carriages and riding horses required by a wealthy household. Head grooms, stable boys, coachmen lived in chambers above the stables, part of the small army required to maintain 40 Hall's splendour. By 1632, the year Nicholas Rainton became Lord Mayor of London, 40 Hall was complete. The total cost is unrecorded, but comparable houses of similar size and quality cost between £3,000 and £6,000 to build, equivalent to perhaps £4 to £8 million today. Add the cost of furnishings, gardens and land, and Rainton's total investment likely approached £10,000, a sum that would buy several large country estates or fund a major trading expedition. This was not a house, it was a statement. Nicholas Rainton, son of a farmer, had built a palace. He was 63 years old. He had 23 years left to live, and he would spend 14 of them as a prisoner. The year 1632 should have been Nicholas Rainton's triumph. On October 29th, he was formally elected Lord Mayor of London in a ceremony at Guildhall attended by thousands. He processed through the city in a gilded barge, accompanied by musicians and heralds, to Westminster, where he took his oath before the King's Court of Exchequer. For the next 12 months, he was master of London, the man who controlled access to the nation's wealth. But 1632 was also the year when everything began to unravel, not just for Rainton, but for England itself. King Charles I, who had ascended the throne in 1625, was locked in an increasingly bitter conflict with Parliament over money, power, and religion. Charles believed in divine right, the theory that kings answered only to God and could rule without Parliament. Parliament believed they held the purse strings and could force the king to negotiate. It was a constitutional crisis that would eventually explode into civil war and cost Charles his head. But in 1632, the war was still political, fought with loans and taxes rather than swords. Charles needed money desperately. His wars with Spain and France had drained the treasury. His court was expensive. His French Catholic queen, Henrietta Maria, needed a chapel and household. To fund his government without calling Parliament, Charles resorted to forced loans, demanding that wealthy subjects lend him money with no guarantee of repayment. These weren't really loans. They were taxes without parliamentary approval, illegal under English law, tyrannical by any measure. But Charles didn't care about legality. He needed money, and the Lord Mayor of London controlled access to the richest men in England. In 1640, Charles demanded that the City of London provide a loan of £100,000. £100,000, equivalent to perhaps £150 million today, an astronomical sum, enough to fund entire wars. The loan was to be raised from the wealthiest merchants, apportioned according to their means. Nicholas Rainton, one of the richest men in London, was assessed at £500, a fortune in itself. And Nicholas Rainton, son of a farmer, self-made merchant prince, Lord Mayor of London, said no. We don't know his exact words. We don't have a transcript of the meeting where he refused. But we know the consequences. Saying no to Charles I was not a political disagreement. It was treason. It was a challenge to royal authority. It was unforgivable. Rainton's refusal wasn't isolated. Other wealthy Londoners also balked at the forced loan, but Rainton's resistance was the most visible because of his position. The Lord Mayor refusing to help the king was a scandal, an outrage, a threat to the entire system of royal authority. Charles responded swiftly and brutally. In November 1640, Nicholas Rainton was arrested and imprisoned. Not in the Tower of London, which would have made him a political martyr, not in some dank dungeon. Charles chose a crueler punishment. Nicholas Rainton was placed under house arrest at Forty Hall. He was imprisoned in his own palace, confined to the very monument he had built to celebrate his success. Imagine the psychology of it. Every ornamental ceiling mocked him. Every carved overmantel was a reminder of powerlessness. Every window looking out over his deer park showed him freedom he couldn't access. He could walk through his great chamber, but he couldn't leave his grounds. He could sit in his parlour, but he couldn't conduct business. He could sleep in his bed, but guards watched his doors. The house designed to announce power became a prison, announcing impotence. How long did the imprisonment last? Records are unclear. Some sources suggest months. Others hint it may have been longer, perhaps more than a year. Either way, Rainton was released eventually, probably after paying a massive fine and offering public submission. But the damage was done. His health was broken. His reputation was stained. The man who had built Forty Hall as a monument to immortality discovered that power was ephemeral, that wealth couldn't protect against royal anger, that even palaces could become cages. Nicholas Rainton lived 6 more years after his release, but they were years of decline. He was 71 years old when freed, ancient by 17th century standards. The imprisonment had exhausted him. He withdrew from public life, spending most of his time at Forty Hall, no longer the triumphant Lord Mayor, but a cautionary tale about the limits of merchant power. He continued managing his trading interests, but with less vigor. The energy that had built an empire was gone. He prepared for death with the thoroughness he had once applied to business. He arranged his will, distributing his wealth among family members and charitable causes. The Haberdashers' Company, which had been the foundation of his fortune, received a generous bequest to fund almshouses for poor members. St. Andrew's Church in Enfield, where he worshipped, received money for maintenance and a beautiful pulpit. On October 16, 1646, Nicholas Rainton died at Forty Hall, aged 77. He was buried at St. Andrew's Church in a tomb marked by a monument that still survives, showing him kneeling in prayer, dressed in the robes of a Lord Mayor, his achievements carved in stone for posterity. The monument lists his accomplishments: Master of the Haberdashers' Company, Lord Mayor of London, benefactor to the poor. It doesn't mention the imprisonment. It doesn't mention the king who made his final years miserable. Official memory is selective. Forty Hall passed to his great-nephew, also named Nicholas Rainton, a young man who had none of his great-uncle's business acumen, but inherited all his property. The younger Nicholas was perfectly content to live as a country gentleman, managing the estate without ambition, collecting rents, hunting deer, avoiding politics and trade. He was, in other words, exactly what his great-uncle had spent a lifetime trying not to be. But the younger Rainton made one crucial decision that would shape Forty Hall's future for centuries. In 1656, he purchased the neighbouring estate that contained the ruins of Elsyng Palace. Remember Elsyng, the Tudor palace whose foundations lay beneath Forty Hall's park? By 1656, even those foundations were mostly invisible, overgrown with weeds, slowly sinking into oblivion. The younger Nicholas Rainton had the ruins demolished completely, carting away the last stones, erasing the final traces of royal presence. Then he demolished the manor house that had been built from Elsyng's materials and expanded Forty Hall's park northward, absorbing Elsyng's former grounds into his own deer park, one palace consuming another, the merchant prince's descendant literally paving over royalty. The expansion doubled Forty Hall's parkland to about 80 acres, creating the landscape that largely survives today. Trees were planted, avenues laid out, ponds dug. The younger Nicholas Rainton wasn't an empire builder like his great-uncle, but he was an accomplished landscape designer, creating one of the most beautiful parks in Middlesex. The hall remained in the Rainton family for several more decades, but by the end of the 17th century, the family's wealth was declining. Without the constant infusion of trading profits that the elder Nicholas had generated, the estate became expensive to maintain. The house itself was aging, needing repairs. And then, sometime around 1696, disaster struck. Historical evidence strongly suggests there was a major fire at Forty Hall, though no contemporary account survives describing it. The evidence is architectural. When the house was restored in the 1690s, major structural changes were made that only make sense as fire damage repairs. The roof was rebuilt. Sections of the interior were gutted and reconstructed. And most dramatically, the great staircase was moved from its central position to the northwest corner of the house. If there was indeed a fire, it must have been devastating, perhaps destroying the entire interior of the central block. The restoration work was likely funded by the new owner, John Wolstenholme, who purchased the property in 1696. John Wolstenholme remains a shadowy figure. He may have been descended from the famous Jacobean merchant and financier Sir John Wolstenholme, a member of the Virginia Company who had helped fund the Jamestown colony. If so, he inherited wealth rather than earning it, and he used that wealth to transform Forty Hall into a Georgian gentleman's villa. The restoration following the presumed fire changed the house's external appearance dramatically. The Jacobean facade, with its varied brickwork and decorative details, was simplified and regularized. Windows were made more uniform. The roof line was altered. A new wing was added to the southwest, extending the house and providing additional reception rooms. Most dramatically, Wolstenholme planted the great avenue that still defines Forty Hall's landscape. This avenue runs due south from the house down Forty Hill and into the valley of the Turkey Brook, a straight line nearly half a mile long, planted with elm trees spaced with mathematical precision. Walking down this avenue, you experience pure Enlightenment rationality, nature subjected to human geometry, wilderness tamed by order. The avenue served both aesthetic and practical purposes. Aesthetically, it created a magnificent approach to the house, a green corridor channeling visitors toward the mansion. Practically, it announced ownership. Anyone looking north from the valley saw that avenue and knew this land belongs to someone powerful enough to plant hundreds of trees purely for visual effect. Wolstenholme also modernized the interior, though much of his work has since been altered or removed. He updated the great chamber, adding new plasterwork in the lighter, more delicate Georgian style. He created a library, filling it with books on agriculture, philosophy, and classical literature. He installed new fireplaces with marble surrounds carved by Italian craftsmen. The house was transitioning from Jacobean grandeur to Georgian elegance, from the heavy magnificence of the 17th century to the refined taste of the 18th. In 1740, the estate changed hands again, purchased by Eliab Breton, another wealthy merchant. Breton continued the process of Georgian modernization, remodeling the ground floor rooms to create more open, flowing spaces. The rigid Jacobean room divisions were softened. Doorways were widened. Windows were enlarged to let in more light. The house was becoming lighter, brighter, more comfortable. Later 18th century owners included Edmund Armstrong in 1787 and James Meyer in 1799. The Meyer family would own Forty Hall for nearly a century, the longest ownership period in the house's history. They were deeply involved in Enfield's civic life, using their wealth to improve the community. In 1835, they funded the construction of Jesus Church, a beautiful Gothic revival church that still serves the local community. The Meyers treated Forty Hall as both a private residence and a public good, opening the grounds occasionally for community celebrations. But by the late 19th century, maintaining a property like Forty Hall was becoming increasingly difficult. The old landed wealth was declining, undermined by agricultural depression and rising taxes. The house needed constant expensive repairs. The staff required to maintain it was prohibitively costly. The Meyer family began looking for a buyer, someone with both wealth and the desire to maintain a historic property. In 1894, they found one. Henry Carrington Bowles of Middleton House, the neighbouring estate. Bowles didn't want Forty Hall for himself. He was in his 60s and settled at Middleton. He purchased it for his son, Major Henry Ferryman Bowles. Major Henry Ferryman Bowles was everything the original Nicholas Rainton wasn't: aristocratic by temperament, born to wealth, educated at the finest schools, serving in the military and Parliament not to earn status, but because that's what men of his class did. He became the Member of Parliament for Enfield, and would later be created first Baronet Bowles, achieving the hereditary title that Rainton could only dream of. Bowles modernised Forty Hall again, this time for the Edwardian age. In 1897, he significantly enlarged the southwest wing, adding new reception rooms and modernising the plumbing and heating. Electric lighting was installed, replacing candles and gas. Bathrooms with running water replaced chamber pots and washstands. The house was dragged into the 20th century while maintaining its historic character. The Bowles family's tenure at Forty Hall coincided with massive social changes. The First World War decimated the servant class. By the 1920s, it was impossible to staff a house like Forty Hall the way it had been staffed in Rainton's day. The general strike of 1926 and the Great Depression that followed made maintaining large estates even more difficult. taxes on wealth increased, death duties consumed inheritance. The old way of life was ending. Major Bowles died in 1943 during the Second World War, when Forty Hall was requisitioned for war use. The house served as offices for the wartime bureaucracy, its beautiful rooms filled with filing cabinets and typewriters, its parkland used for civil defense training. After the war, the Bowles family faced a decision common to hundreds of aristocratic families: sell the estate to developers who would demolish the house and build suburban housing, or find another option. In 1951, they chose public service. The Bowles family sold Forty Hall and its grounds to the municipal borough of Enfield, the predecessor of today's London Borough of Enfield. The sale price was never publicly disclosed, but it was certainly far below market value. The family could have earned much more selling to developers. Instead, they chose to preserve Forty Hall for future generations. The house would become a museum, the grounds a public park. Nicholas Rainton's palace, which had imprisoned him, which had sheltered merchants and gentlemen for 3 centuries, would now belong to everyone. The transformation of Forty Hall into a public museum was gradual and not always successful. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the house hosted changing exhibitions about local history, but funding was limited and maintenance was deferred. By the 1990s, Forty Hall was showing its age badly. Paint peeled from walls, roofs leaked, historic plasterwork deteriorated from water damage. The house was quietly crumbling. Then, in the early 2000s, Enfield Council commissioned a comprehensive conservation plan, a detailed architectural and historical survey to understand exactly what they owned and how to preserve it. The resulting document, produced by conservation architects and historians, ran to hundreds of pages and contained shocking revelations. For decades, everyone had assumed that the 18th century renovations had destroyed most of Forty Hall's original 17th century features. The conservation survey proved otherwise. Behind later panelling and plaster, Jacobean decorative elements survived intact. The Great Staircase, though moved in the 1690s, could be returned to its original position using surviving structural evidence. Original window frames survived beneath Georgian replacements. The house was like a palimpsest, layer upon layer of history, each era adding to rather than erasing what came before. Armed with this knowledge, Enfield Council applied for major funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund, a British organisation that uses lottery proceeds to preserve historic properties. In 2009, they received a grant of £3.7 million, enough to undertake the most comprehensive restoration in Forty Hall's history. The house closed to the public in late 2010. For 18 months, it became a construction site, albeit one managed by conservation experts using historic techniques. Modern additions were carefully removed. Hidden Jacobean features were revealed and conserved. The Great Staircase was painstakingly reconstructed in something approximating its original position, based on evidence from floor joists, paint marks, and plaster details. The project wasn't about returning Forty Hall to a single moment in time, a common but misguided approach to historic preservation. Instead, the goal was to reveal the house's full history, showing how it evolved across 4 centuries. Georgian modifications were preserved alongside Jacobean originals. Victorian additions were maintained where they added to the story. The result is a house that honestly shows its age, its transformations, its complex past. On June 30th, 2012, Forty Hall reopened to the public. The restoration had been a triumph. Visitors could now see not just a museum, but a time machine, walking through rooms that spanned from 1632 to the present, each century leaving its mark. The permanent exhibition, designed by museum professionals, tells the story of the house, the estate, and Sir Nicholas Rainton himself, the ambitious haberdasher who built a palace and ended up imprisoned in it. Interactive displays explain 17th century life, The role of merchants in creating England's empire, the architectural techniques used to build the house. Guided tours led by actors in Jacobean costume bring the past to life, servants and merchants and nobles walking through the rooms they once inhabited. The exhibition program features rotating displays of art, historical artifacts, and natural history, connecting Forty Hall to broader cultural conversations. An ecology program focuses on the estate's natural environment, the 260 acres of parkland that now form part of London's metropolitan green belt, preserved forever from development. Walk through Forty Hall's grounds today, and you experience landscape shaped by 4 centuries of changing visions. Immediately around the house, formal gardens have been restored based on archaeological evidence and historic garden design principles. Box hedges form geometric patterns. Gravel paths lead between planted beds. It's a 17th century garden filtered through 21st century understanding, historically informed but not slavishly accurate. Beyond the formal gardens, the landscape opens into parkland, rolling green hills dotted with ancient trees. The great avenue planted by John Wolstenholme in the 1690s still exists, though the original elms died from Dutch elm disease in the 1970s and were replaced with limes. Walking down that avenue today, you retrace the path of everyone who has approached Forty Hall for 3 centuries. Merchants, politicians, royalty, soldiers, school children. Just west of the house stands one of the estate's greatest treasures, a cedar of Lebanon of truly ancient provenance. This massive tree, with its characteristic layered branches spreading horizontally like architectural elements, may be over 300 years old, planted sometime in the late 17th or early 18th century, when cedars were exotic rarities brought to England from the eastern Mediterranean. It's now designated one of the great trees of London, and holds the title of County Girth Champion for Greater London, meaning it has the largest trunk circumference of any cedar of Lebanon in the metropolitan area. Standing beneath its branches, you're in the presence of a living witness to Forty Hall's entire history as a public space. Further into the park, a small lake reflects the sky, created by damming the Turkey Brook, the stream that forms the northern boundary of the estate. This brook is also known locally as Maiden's Brook, though the origin of that name is lost. The lake was created in the 18th century as a landscape feature, part of the English landscape garden movement that transformed formal geometric gardens into naturalistic compositions. Swans glide across the water. Ducks nest in the reeds. It's peaceful, pastoral, thoroughly English. The northern and southern boundaries of the estate are marked by the former course of the New River, an extraordinary piece of 17th century engineering that deserves its own digression. The New River isn't actually a river, it's an aqueduct, a man-made channel constructed between 1609 and 1613 to bring fresh water from springs in Hertfordshire to London, a distance of about 40 miles. It was one of the great engineering achievements of the age, solving London's water crisis by creating an artificial river that followed the land's contours, flowing gently downhill at a gradient of just 2 inches per mile. The New River passed right by Forty Hill, and its presence was one of the factors that made this an attractive location for building. Fresh running water meant gardens could be irrigated, ornamental features could be created, and most importantly, disease risk was reduced. Wealthy people understood that water quality affected health, even if they didn't understand germ theory. In the 20th century, as London's water supply became more sophisticated, the New River was rerouted, straightened for efficiency. The old meandering course near Forty Hall was abandoned, but it can still be traced in the landscape, a depression in the ground following an ancient path. Today, about 260 acres of Forty Hall's estate are open to the public as parkland and farm. Yes, farm. Part of the estate is still actively farmed, maintaining a tradition that goes back to the property's origins. Forty Hall Farm grows vegetables and keeps animals, operating as a working farm, that also serves educational purposes. School groups visit to learn where food comes from, how farming works, the connection between land and table. It's a living link to the agricultural economy that created the wealth that built the house. Throughout the year, the grounds host events, open-air concerts, historical reenactments, craft fairs, guided nature walks. Forty Hall has become what Nicholas Rainton could never have imagined, not a private monument to individual achievement, but a public commons, a space belonging to everyone, where history is not locked behind gates, but opened for all to experience. Standing today in Forty Hall's great chamber, looking up at the ornamental plasterwork that survived fire and neglect and centuries of changing taste, it's impossible not to reflect on the strange fate of monuments. Nicholas Rainton built this house to establish permanence, to create something that would outlast him, to announce to future generations that he had mattered, that he had achieved, that he had existed. And in a sense, he succeeded. Forty Hall still stands. His name is still attached to it. Visitors still marvel at what he created. But his monument succeeded only because it was taken from him, because it ceased to be private property and became public heritage. The very thing that would have most horrified Rainton, losing control, seeing commoners walk freely through his great chamber, is what saved Forty Hall from demolition. If it had remained a private house, it would almost certainly have been destroyed in the 20th century, a victim of death duties, development pressure, or simple neglect. How many other great houses of the Jacobean age vanished that way? Hundreds, thousands. But Forty Hall survived because it was given away, because the Bowles family in 1951 chose preservation over profit. There's a deeper irony here, one that Nicholas Rainton experienced personally and bitterly. He built Forty Hall to celebrate power, and it became the place where his powerlessness was most apparent. He was imprisoned in his own palace, confined to the monument he created, his freedom curtailed by the very walls he had ordered built. The house designed to announce independence became the instrument of his subjection. And what of Elsyng Palace, the royal residence whose foundations lie somewhere beneath Forty Hall's grounds? Elsyng was built to announce royal power, to demonstrate that kings could afford palaces in distant corners of their realm. And yet Elsyng is gone, erased so completely that even its exact location is debated. Archaeological excavations in the park have searched for its foundations, finding tantalizing fragments, bits of Tudor tile, sections of wall, but never enough to reconstruct the palace, or even fully map its extent. The royal palace vanished. The merchant's house survived. There's a lesson in that, though exactly what lesson is unclear. Perhaps it's that royal power is even more ephemeral than merchant wealth. Or perhaps it's simply that survival is random, contingent on 1,000 unpredictable factors, and reading meaning into it is our attempt to impose pattern on chaos. What we can say with certainty is this: Forty Hall stands today as a witness to 4 centuries of English history, to the rise of merchant capitalism, to the English Civil War, to the Agricultural Revolution, to the World Wars, to the creation of the welfare state and public heritage. It has housed haberdashers and gentlemen, soldiers and bureaucrats, and now it houses everyone, a democratic monument to an undemocratic age. Nicholas Rainton, the farmer's son who became Lord Mayor and built a palace, would perhaps be gratified to know his house survived. He might even, in his more generous moments, appreciate that it survived by becoming something greater than a private monument, a public trust, a space where anyone can walk through history and imagine the lives lived within these walls. Or he might hate it. We'll never know. The dead don't speak, and their monuments tell only the stories we choose to read in them. But Forty Hall does speak, if you listen carefully. It speaks about ambition and its limits, about power and its ephemerality, about the strange immortality of buildings that outlive their builders and their purposes. It speaks about the complexity of history, layers upon layers, each era adding to and changing what came before, nothing ever purely preserved, everything always in transition. Most of all, it speaks about the enduring human need to build, to create, to leave something behind. Nicholas Rainton, whoever he really was beneath the historical fragments, understood that need. He built 40 Hall to say, "I was here, I mattered, remember me." 400 years later, we remember. The house still stands. And every visitor who walks through its doors, every child who runs through its park, every scholar who studies its history, fulfills Rainton's deepest wish: to be remembered, to matter, to not be erased. In that sense, despite everything, despite imprisonment, despite losing the house, despite the long, slow transformation from private palace to public museum, Nicholas Rainton won. His monument survived, and we remember.